Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. You are listening to a rebroadcast of a previously recorded show.
All right, we're back to Casey. And Casey, this is so much fun. I'm sure you volunteering as well. And so it's been our third year we've worked together. I was 1 year before that, and you've had me for 3, right, Casey, being my volunteer?
At least 3 now.
At least 3. This is my 5th year. It's only 4 years. I don't know if we're not connected on Facebook, but I had to do some throwback Thursday stuff of when I was physically at the book fair, and it's quite interesting to look at. And the things I'm still trying to find my interview that I did live with Bob Marley's niece, and it was phenomenal, Sedelia, and Sedelia, and we sung one of the songs. I can't find the YouTube on it. I have to ask Eric tomorrow, where is it? I've been searching and Googling everywhere. I want to post it on all my social media sites for sure. All right, Casey, who do we have next?
Okay, next up we have Harry Lembeck, the author of Taking on Theodore Roosevelt.
All right. So I'd like to welcome to the program Harry Lembeck. Harry, thanks for calling, and welcome to Author's Corner live from the Miami Book Fair Total Education Network. How are you?
I'm fine, Neil. Great to be here.
Oh, it is great to be here. And I think is this your first time at the fair?
My first time. I used to live in Miami. This is my first time at the book fair.
And
I'm really enjoying it.
You didn't? Did you? I mean, this. There's nothing like it. I mean, I was talking about it when I came on air. I can't believe the number of people that come to this fair and how popular it is. When people talk about book fairs, they're a lot smaller in scale and size compared to this, right?
Yeah, I think the Miami Book Fair International is one of the preeminent book fairs now in the world.
It is.
It really is. So it's a real honor for me to be here, and it's fun to be back in Miami.
Okay, so tell us a little bit about your background, Harry, and then we're going to get right into your book and conversations, more of a conversation style type interview. So, nuts and bolts about who you are first.
Oh, I'm a recovering lawyer, which means I'm doing penance for practicing law many years. But now I do writing full time. I'm originally from the Bronx, grew up in Ohio, went to the Ohio State University. After Ohio State, I joined the Marines and served from 1967 to 1971 as a Marine officer. Came out of the Marines, came down to South Florida, but now I live in Marietta, Georgia, with my wife, Emily, who is the superintendent of schools up there. And we like it very much. Excuse me.
Oh, wow, she's the superintendent of schools, so she's staying busy while you're enjoying the writing thing, and especially in education today, she must be very busy, right? Being a superintendent
She's very
of schools.
Busy. Yeah. She's very busy. I spend many nights alone, eating alone. She's very busy, but she does very well. I'm very proud of her. A couple of years ago, she was the Georgia Superintendent of the Year, and she has received many, many honors, and I'm just very proud of her. And she does a wonderful job.
Wow. And so when you were doing your long hours as a lawyer, now it's payback while she's doing them, right? Moving up her ladder in education, right? So,
right.
Because she probably put a lot of years in as a teacher and as a principal to get to that level as a superintendent,
right.
didn't she?
Right.
Yeah. Well, my education show, I'd love to have her on sometime, so we'll definitely try to stay in touch and see if she can, she ever wants. Sure. I would love to talk to her about, education in general, and I'm sure the conversations at the dinner table about education are quite interesting, to say the least, aren't they?
Very much. But Emily was the one that got me involved in Theodore Roosevelt. And,
really?
She handed me a book about Theodore Roosevelt maybe, 18 or so, about 18 years ago. And said, "Did you like this book?" And I did, and I was fascinated by him. And I became very involved with the Theodore Roosevelt Association in Oyster Bay, New York. I particularly liked its scholarly type programs, but it does much more than that. Any listener that's interested in Theodore Roosevelt should think about joining the Theodore Roosevelt Association. And through that, I met many stars. I met Edmund Morris, I met David McCullough, and others like that. And they helped me with my book, some of them. And I really developed a passion for TRs. I wrote a book about them.
Interesting. So it's interesting how you get interested in something, it becomes a passion for you, and you say, I'm going to go ahead and do this. This is something I'm going to go ahead and try. And
we need a wife that says, "Go ahead and do it." And I did.
So as a leader, as her leadership role, saying, "Go ahead, do this," and then it's like hand in hand. You were always the attorney while she was the educator. Now you're being the educator as well, because educating people about Theodore Roosevelt. And before you wrote the book, and before you became a historical advisor for PBS and all these different things that you've done, did you know a lot about him growing up?
No, I knew what most people know of him, big teeth and glasses and a mustache and bully and this sort of thing. But he was a fascinating man. He was more than that. He was the parts are greater than the whole, each individual part. He was a constitutional scholar. He was a rough rider. He was a rancher. The stories of him when he was a rancher in North Dakota are legendary and fascinating. He went to war. He's the only American president to ever kill a man, killed a Spanish soldier in Cuba. But he was and of course he was a great president. But he had a flaw, which is generally glossed over by historians and biographers. I always thought, because it was unexplainable why a man such as Theodore Roosevelt, such a great man, would do what he did in the Brownsville incident, which is what I write about. And I one day said to myself, I wonder why he really did do it. And so I got into it. And I found a different TR. I always tell people, because my book is somewhat critical of him, but I always tell people that he's still a great man. He's still a great president. He still deserves his place up on Mount Rushmore. I point out to people, look at the company he shares on Mount Rushmore. The father of our country, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the man who saved the Union, and Theodore Roosevelt. He deserves that place, but he did make a mistake. And history has to acknowledge it. And he acknowledged it, too, years later, of course.
Fascinating to say the least. And I guess we look back in presidents' lives, and that's another conversation started in a lot of ways, Harry, and how we're vetting people who are running for president now or going back to presidents when they're running for president or a president back to the different times in their lives. And just imagine if this happened with Theodore Roosevelt in the time of what our news cycle is today. Yeah.
First of all, I don't think it would have happened. I don't think he could have done what he did, discharged an entire battalion of soldiers, or in this case, Buffalo soldiers, black soldiers, from the Army without court-martial, and hope to get away with it, as he did in Brownsville. So I don't think it would happen now. But if it did happen, I can only imagine the blowback. And I think he was able to finesse his problem of what he did to these soldiers by converting it from a discussion of justice to a discussion of politics. Once the Senate began to investigate what he did, the Senate investigation of the Brownsville incident became a political question. And when it came to political questions, there was none better than Theodore Roosevelt. And so, of course, he won. But I don't think it ever would have come to that today.
No.
No, the Brownsville incident never could have taken place today. I don't think.
Now, kind of bring us back, and we don't want to give away the book, but I'm so interested historically about this, Harry, about why this ended up occurring. What was Theodore Roosevelt's take in deciding for this incident to occur, and how it kind of surprised you about the person, Harry? Just to take us back to that incident for sure.
Well, the incident took place in 1906. There was a shooting in Brownsville, Texas, between 12 and 20 men who rampaged through the town close to midnight and shot up the town, killed one man, severely wounded another. His arm had to be amputated. There were witnesses and there was evidence that tended to show that the shooters were soldiers from Fort Brown. There were some Army investigations. There were some civilian investigations. The civilian investigations identified 12 soldiers who might have been shooters, but the Cameron County grand jury would not indict them because they said there's no evidence that these were the shooters. The Cameron County grand jury agreed that the shooters had been soldiers, but which ones? Remember, this was in the Jim Crow era of Jim Crow in the South, and this is in Texas. And right. So it's something to note that a grand jury in Texas would not indict these soldiers in those days, which tends to show you how difficult it would have been to court-martial them. And this was the problem Roosevelt faced. He was convinced soldiers had been shooters. He was convinced that other soldiers had covered up for them. He could not keep them in the Army. He could not. How could he for example, how could he transfer these men to another post in the United States? What community would accept murderers?
Right.
And so he did what he thought was the appropriate thing. He discharged them from the Army in an administrative discharge. It was portrayed as a dishonorable discharge, but that became a canard that everybody accepted, but it was not. They were separated from the Army. They were sent home. They were given pay up until the day they were discharged. They were given travel allowance back to their home of record. Those who later would die, some were buried in Arlington Cemetery. So this is any value to them while they're alive. But I mentioned only to point out that obtained some rights, but they were discharged from the Army. And he said, look, this is not a punishment for the reasons I just gave. He gave those same reasons. And he said, they're just out of the Army. And in 1970, when President Nixon was in office, the Army decided that the discharges had to be changed to honorable discharges, and they were. And the following year, now President Ford was in the White House, the Congress voted to give surviving soldiers, of which there was only one, and surviving widows, of which there were few, a payment. The soldier Dorsey Willis, living in Minneapolis, received a payment of $25,000. Interesting, Dorsey Willis was the last man discharged when they discharged the soldiers in Oklahoma, and he was the last man to die, and he received the payment. So in the end, justice was made, but too late for any of the soldiers to really realize it in any meaningful way, even Dorsey Willis. And that's where we are today. We don't know today who the shooters were. One of the mistakes he made in not having a trial was we were never able to get evidence as to what exactly happened. If the soldiers were guilty, then they might have had evidence to prove it. If they could not prove the soldiers were guilty because they could not get the evidence, this would tend to maybe dispute the decision and conclusion that soldiers had been shooters. But we don't know.
African-American soldiers in 1906 had absolutely no rights. So if you can pinpoint a fall guy, you're going to go and pick these guys.
They did have the right to a trial. I'll point out that at the time of the shooting in August, no one disputed that soldiers, it was a big story. No one disputed that the soldiers had been shooters. Booker T. Washington said the soldiers had been shooters. W.E.B. Du Bois said the soldiers had been shooters. This was in August. Nobody disputed it. When November came, and now it's a few months later, and Roosevelt discharged them, that's when the firestorm erupted, because they still were entitled to a trial.
Right.
Remember, these were soldiers. There were articles of war. We don't have the articles of war anymore. We have something called the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But in those days, you had articles of war which guaranteed them a trial. That was their argument, and I must say it's a good argument.
Well, it definitely is, and Roosevelt just basically did not want to defend these to help these guys and help them in this process. And it didn't.
No, as I say that. Yeah. That was his second mistake. The first mistake was throwing them out of the Army. The second mistake was the really bullying, brutal. I use the term brutal in the book. The bullying, the brutal way he defended his decision. And it showed a Theodore Roosevelt that we rarely see. This is not the man we think is on Mount Rushmore. But that's why I wrote the book, because it's part of history. It's part of his history.
Yes.
And frankly, as I say, I think, yes, it does chip away at his greatness, of course, overall greatness.
And I think it's important from the discussion. But then as historians, Harry, we have to do this. We have to tell all sides of the story. Just like in science, we have to talk about both sides of the story. When we make it and limit it to just one narrative, it eliminates the ability for our students, either high school, middle school, college, or even sixth graders, fifth graders, to learn there's more than one side to stories, that there are different narratives, and just because what you hear on the news or read in your history books, sometimes there's another story to it. And I think
you're right.
Yeah.
you're exact. And Theodore Roosevelt would agree with you. And I have a quotation from him. Theodore Roosevelt, among other things, was a president of the American Historical Association. He was a historian. He made a living writing history, and he himself said, and I can't recite it as well as he wrote it, so won't try now. But basically, what he says is, if you're just going to lay out the facts that support your case, this isn't history. This is a romance. This is a romantic novel. He said everything has to be examined. It has to be thorough, and we have to have every side of the discussion shown for it to be real history. And so I say he would have agreed with what I did. He would say, yes, let's find, certainly after 115 years, 110 years, let's get it done. And I think he'd shake my hand.
See, Harry, the other thing, as an undergrad in history, I get so annoyed when we don't want to talk politics on both sides of the aisle. We cannot have a specific opinion and are considered wrong about it, and that you have. In our country, we need to be able to bring both sides to everything. And historically,
right.
Well, you're wrong. Well, why are you going to close yours? I have a co-host of mine who's a union rep, and I take both sides, parents and teachers, regardless, just based on whatever the story is. And he constantly refutes any of my arguments that involve any history. Mm-hmm. Well, anything that comes up on Columbus, well, there's other people saying Columbus is different. Well, you're wrong. Well, why can't we have this conversation? Right. Why do we have to paint a picture of Columbus like this when there are other people saying differently? And why don't we bring out everything and then let the narrative say and let people decide for themselves? Not.
Well, yeah. One of the problems with what I've done and with what you're saying is that people then take to study the man and make conclusions about the man, in one case Columbus, in another case Theodore Roosevelt, based upon our times, not their times.
Yes.
And so you have to, now, in my opinion, regardless of any time, Theodore Roosevelt's decision not to send these men to a trial was wrong. It was wrong then, it is wrong now. But to say, well, wait a minute, he did it for some racial reasons, in my opinion, if you look at the era, Theodore Roosevelt was an extreme progressive on the matter of race relations. His relationship with Booker T. Washington, who had a virtual veto over federal appointments in the South, because Theodore Roosevelt trusted Booker T. Washington. Theodore Roosevelt invited Washington to dine at the White House, the first black man ever to dine with the president in the White House. And I don't want to waste your time now, but they are in the book, of course, stories of how he defended blacks in the South and had his attorney general institute cases in the South against the practice of what was called peonage, which is basically slavery by another name. And there was a Pulitzer Prize-winning book about peonage called Slavery by Another Name. So for his time, he was very progressive. But for any time, his or ours, these men were entitled to a trial.
All right, well, Harry, and that's another book for you to write. We have another book. We have another book for you to write. And so, where can we find information on you? Purchase your book and learn more about you. Where can we go?
Well, there's a Facebook page for the book, Taking on Theodore Roosevelt, and there's a website, HarryLembeckBooks.com, and the book can be purchased at most bookstores, either online, certainly on Amazon.com and other online sellers, and the bookstores themselves, both in the store or online. And there's a Kindle version of it, too, by the way. So it's easy to find, and it's got, I hate to sound immodest, but it's really got some very good reviews. I'm tickled. So, and I appreciate your time this morning.
I have to ask those questions because how are we going to learn?
Oh, you did fine.
Oh, thanks. All right, take care, Harry.
It was not only an honor, but it was fun speaking to you.
All right, now back to Casey now. All right, thanks again, Harry. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Thank you for listening to Life Improvement Radio. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own and shall not be construed in any way as advice from Life Improvement Radio. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our website. Personal perspectives expressed by the producers, writers, or editors will always be presented as such. Any rebroadcast or retransmission without the expressed written consent of Life Improvement Radio is strictly prohibited. Thanks for listening.